Good morning and good evening to everyone. My name is Shreya Nagaraj Singh. I'm the founder of SNS Arts Development Consultancy in Chennai. On behalf of CAREspaces and SNS, I would like to welcome every member of our diverse Indian arts community who are watching with us right now to our fifth and final session of our five-part series called I'm a Professional Too. Our series as a whole places importance on the pillars of ethical professionalism. We at SNS and CareSpaces share the common goal of bringing accountability and ethical professional practices to our Indian art space. We started this series at the beginning of this year, and we absolutely are delighted by the way it has all taken shape and form despite all the different things that have been happening in the US and in India and with our own personal communities. Our first session was about defining workspaces, which was followed by two fantastic sessions with the law and contracts for artists specifically, titled Understanding Your Creative IP, and the second one was about knowing your rights. Our fourth session was all about how to value your work and as an artist, take your place in a strong stand in a very informal creative economy. All of these sessions are available on the CareSpaces YouTube channel, so please do check it out if you haven't seen them already. Today, we present our final session called Draw Your Boundaries, moderated by two of the co-founders of CareSpaces, whom I've had the delightful experience to work with, Neha and Jenna. But before we begin the session, we want to make a note here that this discussion features voices from the creative Indian performing arts, specifically the classical performing arts, and we understand the privilege that comes with the access and proximity to these art forms. Although we may come from different ecosystems, this is a safe space, and that's what we're trying to create here. So we are all approaching this conversation with mutual respect, empathy, active listening, and believe everyone and anyone in this space is equal, regardless of age, gender, or experience. So we request both the speakers and the listeners to do the same. On that note, I would like to hand it over to our moderator, Janani, to take it from here.
Thank you, Shreya. Neha and I thank all of you for being here and sharing your time with us to discuss this very important topic. Before we introduce ourselves and our wonderful panelists, we would like to talk about the premise of our session a bit more.
Thank you, Janani. So to get started, we occupy professional spaces in which being easy to work with and quote unquote flexible are commendable professional traits. But we must ask ourselves, at what cost? We believe being a great collaborator and respecting your limits are both equally essential to professional conduct. Making assertive decisions to draw boundaries, define limits, and articulate your stance often involve weighing options and priorities, which can take a large emotional and mental toll on an individual. This session aims to unpack the practicalities of drawing boundaries in the first half by featuring three artists from the Bharatanatyam, Carnatic music, and Hindustani music spaces. The second half of this conversation will feature subject matter experts who will comment on the artist's challenges while giving you, the audience, tools to help make complex decisions with greater ease and meaningful support. People assume these conversations have to mean you specifically have problems in the space. But we can also talk about what goes well and how to sustain that, along with the difficulties of boundary setting. We also find that many people assume one has to be a survivor of sexual misconduct to have experienced boundary violations or even discuss boundary settings. We want to break that misconception and normalize thinking and talking about boundaries, ideally before any egregious violations occur. Boundary setting can happen in any context, even non-professional context, and they often happen in such minute moments that we tend to recognize them only after they have accumulated. This is why our session is structured in the format of first walking through the journey of three artists who will retrospect on small moments in their journey that continue to define how they set boundaries, what has worked, what hasn't, and also how they can be more honest and things that they can improve upon.
Our community got a glimpse of this on social media with our This or That Story template campaign. We asked our community to publicly or privately reflect on where they are between two factors related to boundary setting, i.e., are your boundaries proactive or reactive, things like that. We got wonderful feedback on that exercise, and many people personally shared how impactful it was for them to explicitly think about these factors. It was hard for many to share the Instagram story publicly because of various reasons, in fear of judgment, of being perceived in certain ways by the professional community, and many, many more. We want to still thank everyone who took a minute to think about that exercise, whether you posted or not. And for those who publicly shared it, we thank you for your trust and strength. We want to share that every panelist here today will be doing that exercise in a very public and vulnerable way. We truly appreciate all of our panelists for trusting us with this conversation and taking several hours of their time to reflect with us. I encourage all of our viewers to not see this as an event, but watch this session with the lens that this is a conversation that is happening in your living room with your dear friends. We hope the way that we navigate this topic will be a starting point for your own conversations amongst your colleagues, friends, and family. With that, I would like to start introducing our panelists with Neha for the first part of our conversation.
First, I'd like to introduce Priya. Priya Purushottamam is a Hindustani vocalist, educator, and writer based in India. She aims to increase awareness about Hindustani music through performance and a pedagogical approach that situates tradition in a contemporary landscape. Welcome, Priya.
Next, I would like to introduce Babajin. Babajin Kumar is a sensitive Bharatanatyam dancer with a captivating stage presence and precision in movement. He's a natural artist with an innate understanding of the art form. Disciple of Leela Samson, Babajin not only imbibes the subtle nuances of his guru's distinctive style, but is also keen to discover the intricacies of the art and strives to adhere to its aesthetics and its spiritual beauty. He's also a dancer in the Spanda Dance Company, known for its innovative choreographies. Thank you, Babajin, for being here.
Sutikshna Veeravalli is a Carnatic vocalist and Bharatanatyam dancer originally from Chicago. Her performances and collaborations take place across North America and India. She is currently pursuing a master's in special education at Boston University and hopes to combine elements of these arts into students' education and well-being. Welcome, Sutikshna.
And of course, I'd love to introduce my co-founder, Neha Krishnamachari, who will also be co-moderating with me today. Neha is the co-founder and head of finance at CAREspaces. She's a trained Carnatic violinist and is currently a finance and strategy professional working at NBC Universal. At CAREspaces, Neha is able to combine her interests in social impact with music and her financial background. Neha is specifically passionate about the future of community organizing and aptly compensating artists to sustain Carnatic music in North America. Thank you, Neha.
Last but not least, for this part of the session, I'd like to introduce Janani. Janani is the co-founder and creative head of CAREspaces, and she's also the co-moderator today. She is trained in vocal Carnatic music and Bharatanatyam. She's an aspiring medical educator and is currently pursuing medical communication and strategy in Dallas, Texas. At CAREspaces, Janani is able to further foster her passion for learning design by crafting educational experiences where stakeholders can learn and grow through the organization's mission and vision. Thank you, Janani. And with that, we'd like to get started with part one of our session. For this part, we'd like our three artists here, Babajin, Sutikshna, and Priya, to reflect on a couple questions Janani and I have. So to begin with, we'd like all of you to share what are some of your non-negotiable boundaries that you set. And just as a reminder, these can be any sort of boundaries. They can be physical, emotional, or financial. Priya, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks, Neha and Janani. I think safety is a non-negotiable boundary for me. Physical safety is a top priority.
Awesome. Sutikshna, would you like to go?
Sure. When I think of a non-negotiable, one of the things that doesn't work for me at all is not being respected, being berated, being told things that kind of dehumanize you. That would be a non-negotiable.
Babajin?
I think I agree with Priya and Sutikshna, and I would also say safety and respect. I think in today's day and age, males also do go through their fair share of harassment and sexual harassment, emotional. So I think definitely safety and respect would definitely be one of my non-negotiable boundaries.
Yeah, that makes
awesome.
sense.
And we also understand that boundaries aren't black and white, and that's really what the session is about. So we want to also talk about what are some fluid boundaries that you usually set that kind of you're okay with changing based on the situation. Priya, again, would you like to start?
Sure. I guess some fluid boundaries would be negotiation, maybe for concerts. about what you expect or what you need. This can be kind of fluid based on the context or the organization, and there's a bit of flexibility with that.
Can you expand upon what you meant by what you may need? Is that in terms of like different access needs, or perhaps like a contract, or compensation?
Yeah, so any of those. So compensation, definitely. It could be even logistics about travel, or there's so many details. So different organizations may be able to offer different, like each of these to a different extent. And though there might be a kind of a baseline boundary or non-negotiable, I think there's still fluidity because there's so many different contexts in which we perform. So it's hard to have a very hard line rule about all the kind of all the components that go into performance.
Got it. And Satikshna, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I do back up Priya on the fact that if there's contractual elements, like when do you get paid, or those logistics, that is hard to be set in stone about across all your performance opportunities.
Mhm.
But I upon thinking about what I have been fluid about, not everything I've been fluid about is something that was voluntary. So I think that itself brings up another can of worms that perhaps we'll unpack later in the session. But I think an example of a situation I've had to be fluid in is, for example, if I were asked by my own teacher, let's say, or someone I do respect or someone I'm comfortable with, to perform for an organization or organizer that I'm not comfortable with. That's a kind of gray area situation. So that's a situation where if I'm not comfortable with the organization or the organizer, meaning or what the organization stands for, let's say, and someone who I do respect is asking me to do it, and I've tried in multiple ways to kind of say, give excuses like I'm busy or whatnot. If they persist, that's something that I can be fluid on, saying as long as I don't have immediate interaction with that person that I'm comfortable with, as long as there's some sort of barrier, that it can be worked around.
Sure. Babajin, would you like to continue?
So because I'm also a teacher, I and most of my students do come from rural parts of India, and economically they may not be of the same as some of my other students. So if I were to say, for example, charge a certain fee and they aren't able to afford it, I have to decide whether I'm going to be a human about it and give them that option of, saying that, don't worry about it. I can adjust. And that would be one of my maybe fluid boundaries, I would say.
Sure, I love that. Accommodating to your stakeholders is really important. All right, Neha, I think we can do a deep dive. So if you want to get started with Priya.
Yeah, for sure. So we sort of had these two questions just to get the juices flowing and to get everyone thinking about what boundary setting means to them. And in this next part of the session, we'll sort of be doing individual artist deep dives where we get to hear the narrative, stories, and experiences from Priya, Babajin, and Satikshna in that order. So with that being said, I'll dive into it with Priya. The first question I sort of have in this context of boundary setting, when we think of recent events in the Hindustani music space, it sort of draws me to all the events that happened with the survivors at the Drupad Sansthan coming out, and really trying to understand how that has changed the conversation of boundary setting in the Hindustani music space. A parallel that I can sort of draw is thinking about how the Carnatic Me Too movement sort of got us speaking about boundaries and safety and misconduct, specifically sexual misconduct, for the first time. So my question to you is, I'm wondering, has the conversation around boundary setting and safety changed since the events of the Drupad Sansthan? And if so, how? And perhaps it hasn't.
Yeah, I think that it has begun. So the change is that it wasn't happening, and now it started in small steps. conversation around just understanding the boundaries between guru and shishya. That was pretty much at the crux of this issue. And after it became more part of the larger discourse and many people were engaging with it, we saw for the first time probably in the Hindustani music ecosystem that people were voicing their opinions. So prior to this, like we did not have a kind of parallel movement when this happened, for instance, in the Carnatic music world. Things were quite silent, and I would say there was still a lot of fear and taboo around discussing these issues. And after this incident, I think at least through social media, we saw that people were being more brave to at least ask questions. What is exploring the many gray areas of this relationship of guru and shishya, and I don't know if the conversation has gone into the details of boundaries, but I think that's really where a lot of the work has to be done. Where do those boundaries come? And of course, it's different for each guru and shishya relationship, but the larger culture around this kind of such a close intertwined period of training is usually that the shishya is really very devoted to the guru, and so will really it'll be hard, I would say, for shishyas to enforce boundaries. But I think slowly now people are probably getting a little more aware and confident to voice their boundaries, even to a guru who could be somebody very, they're in awe of, or somebody they are very even afraid of. So there's so many different kinds of relationships that we can't obviously even begin to kind of capture it. It's so context specific, but the idea is that, yes, I think the awareness is now there that there are certain boundaries, and shishyas should to kind of empower themselves to set those.
That's really great to hear. And I think something that stood out to me about what you said is that this general conversation and acknowledgement that perhaps misconduct happens is slowly happening, but this idea of actively boundary setting is almost like a step two, which I think makes a lot of sense, because it takes a lot of awareness on behalf of any stakeholder to even acknowledge that boundaries need to be made or be set. And then in order to actually apply them is even harder sometimes, right? As you were mentioning, there are so many different dynamics that happen. But overall, that's great to hear that at least like the ball has gotten rolling a little bit. To switch gears, my next question for you is, as an artist, so you did speak a little bit about, you have a little bit of fluidity with some of your boundaries, perhaps with some of these negotiations that might happen back and forth with an organizer. I'm sort of curious, like, what do you lose perhaps when you boundary set? And can you expand upon a time when you may have maybe lost out on an opportunity, but did so in order to keep your boundaries set and sort of stand your ground?
Sure. So I think it is what I really agree with what you just said about it is challenging. The act of setting the boundary is not easy initially. I think it takes time to feel supported to do that, and there's many potential consequences. So sometimes I would say, and I just personally, I think it's taken me a long time to set my boundaries. So it's still new learnings for me. But for instance, maybe not accepting a concert if there's no payment, or the payment is very low. I think a lot of classical musicians, Hindustani, Carnatic, I think this is a pretty common issue, because there's not so much abundant funds to support our arts. So many organizers will call with the first sentence, "Oh, we have a really small budget, and this is really common." But I think sometimes, and that's not to say that I would not do those kind of concerts ever. It's very dependent upon what I might feel is fair given the particular organization and they're larger, how they're placed. But yes, so I've had to say no sometimes if I just felt I don't think this is fair, or I don't think it's fair for my co-artists. There are many times when organizers call and they might offer something reasonable for me, but they might pay my co-artists, like abominably lower, something that they don't really allow me to kind of distribute the money. They insist, and I have said no, that this isn't going to work, like, because I also don't feel that's fair at all. So there are a few times when that has happened, and I've thought about it, and there's a voice, I think, that is always there, that, oh no, you shouldn't, will this matter, does losing out on this impact something else, or you worry about your larger career and your trajectory. But I think, I have no regrets. In the few times I've done it, I've felt it was right. So hopefully it kind of gives me courage to do it more.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. And I think something that you mentioned in one of our previous conversations is how I think all of you have faced this at some point. When you're an artist, you sometimes early on are able to quantify success by the quantity of performances, but then as you mature, you sort of look towards quality, not just being quality of the opportunities, but quality of the experience that you have actually performing and your comfort level. But my follow-up question to you, Priya, is that, so like you said, it's sometimes hard because you're wondering, oh, will this affect something down the line? And I'm wondering how that sort of plays into this idea of being seen as an easy or difficult artist, because that is always something on people's minds, right? Because it's a very small and tight-knit community. So you're always worried if people are going to talk to each other and label or mislabel you in a certain way.
Yeah, I think it's really true. It's a reality that you hear. General reputation is somebody's agreeable, is somebody who probably in boundary language doesn't set many boundaries, but is looked upon favorably in the larger profession. At least certainly by the organizers or the people employing them because of that. And this idea of, I did want to say also, I think it's different boundary setting as a woman and boundary setting as a man. Those are also very different experiences, because the expectations of agreeability, I personally feel, even if you're a woman performer, is a little more. So for instance, if you draw a boundary or you ask for something, I feel that the impression about you as a woman artist is, oh, she's so tough or she's so difficult. It may not be, not that a male artist won't get the same opinion, but I think there's a little more like wiggle room for male artists who ask for things, because I don't think they're judged in on the same standards of how agreeable they should be. But I think definitely for women artists, yes, when you ask, when you just ask something, it's already has an element of confrontation, and that it can be quite difficult.
Yeah, for sure. And as a female identifying artist, how has this conversation of boundary setting, or how people have treated you throughout your artistic journey, changed from the time you first entered the music space to now, like, as you've sort of taken on different identities, right?
Yeah, I think it changes. Definitely age is a big factor in our culture. So there's a automatic age-related respect, or respect isn't the word, but yeah, eventually as you go older and older, it's kind of accorded to you. So when you're younger, and I think that's why it's good to have these discussions, it becomes hard to draw those boundaries, because you're not really you haven't been given the permission necessarily to even set those, because you're young. You're assumed you should be flexible, you shouldn't ask, and maybe there are elements of truth in that. It depends on the situation, but not to an extent where you're suffering or you're going through something. So I think age is a factor that's changed it. Marital status can change it. As if you're people, I can say this, there's a very slight but noticeable change in the way people approach you once they know you're married. So a different kind of, I don't know, boundary that they draw from you, but and in which they kind of back off. So I think all these totally non-music related actually factors also play into people's perception of an artist and then dictate what kind of boundaries can be drawn.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. My sort of concluding question to you, trying to bring things full circle with your journey is, how, how has it been sort of easy or difficult to apply what you've been taught or comfortable with boundary setting in different contexts? And I'm sort of trying to draw out the fact that you, of course, grew up in the United States. You originally learned Carnatic music, then you moved to India. You now live in Bangalore. You pursue Hindustani local music. So as you shifted through different various identities, and taken on different roles as a stakeholder, of artist versus a teacher, and then also been in these distinct musical and international spaces, how has that conversation of boundary setting changed or become easier or difficult?
I think it's just it's been slightly different because in each place because of course geography, culture, and where I personally was in my journey. So, as a young student of Carnatic music, my experience was very different. I mean, I was just a student at that time. So, as a professional, I would say I've only entered it much later in my life into Hindustani music, and I travel, I travel abroad and I perform in India also. So you see slight differences, certainly, in, I would say, the way events are organized or the way people communicate. And, but at the same time, because this is still a very niche kind of music, mostly you're dealing with Indians in India or diasporic Indian communities. So the larger community is still certainly mainly an Indian community. But in the West, sure, I have found that sometimes, you'll get proper written written contracts, emails, where details are confirmed, for instance, for a concert. Usually, I would say in India, I have gotten opportunities like that, but more are verbally spoken, and there's definite kind of the engagement, the relationship, and the way that it's kind of nurtured between an artist and organizer is a bit more personal, as in there's a kind of, everyone likes to be kind of friendly with each other, and sometimes that could make it difficult to draw a boundary because it's not as transactional, but at the same time it's also nice to have that kind of human quality to the interaction. So it's quite there's no black or white answer to this, but it's just different ways of interacting. So I think for an artist, you basically have to be able to set boundaries in many different circumstances.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. I think this is a great way to start off. You have obviously had a very conscious thought process and spent a lot of time thinking about your journey and boundary setting. And I think it has been really insightful, not only for us, but for our viewers as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And also, I just wanted to say very briefly that I think for setting boundaries, that a support system is really important because it's a very vulnerable period. So, organizations like yours and conversations like this become very important. Otherwise, you don't feel kind of comfortable to set those boundaries. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Jenny, and we would love to sort of dive into Babajin and his journey.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you, Priya, as well, for a very insightful first section of our panel. Would love to talk to Babajin about your journey now, Babajin. So I know when we were speaking initially about this conversation, everyone is in a different place in this journey, and I think the biggest reason for that is that we don't have a lot of opportunities to talk to our colleagues, our friends, and family about some of these things. So I don't want to make any assumptions that we've all had an opportunity to talk about this. So I want to ask you, how often have you had a chance to think about boundary setting or, discuss that with any of your peers or mentors?
So, first of all, thank you for having me on this panel, because I think before you even brought this topic to me, I didn't even consciously think about how I have set my boundaries or how I've made these decisions. It was kind of just instinctive. It was kind of, I was just, yeah, like I said, it was very instinctive. But boundary setting has definitely changed over the years. Definitely because of personal experiences or experiences that my friends or peers may have had, and you hear it and you think, okay, maybe I should do it this way, because you don't want to be put in the same situation. Also, for me, luckily, I have wonderful mentors and teachers who I can go to and share very, very traumatic experiences, personal experiences with. So I do have that support system, thankfully. And yes, my peers also do, but sometimes action may not be taken. You have someone to confide in, but after confiding in someone, it may just be for the comfort of, just getting it off your shoulders. But whether something is done about it or not it can't be for sure.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to bring up, that you could have a support system, but it may not be for actually going through with the boundary setting, because that's actually a very personal comfort. And we also recognize that with boundary setting comes a lot of privilege, because you get to say no and lose out on certain things, right? So have your co-artists or you have had a chance to discuss some of those losses that you could have, or do you find that those support structures are still missing?
I think yes. I have had the opportunity to discuss some incidents with my teachers where I've had to maybe say no to an opportunity because of the way an organizer would have maybe behaved or inappropriately. Also, I think there should be, I just would like to bring to attention that, there is a stigma that all male dancers are, maybe homosexual, or there are these stereotypes surrounding male dancers, which is very, very known to everyone. But I think when you're put in a situation where with an organizer where they may be asking for a favor, you would have to step back from that opportunity. And it may feel like you're losing an opportunity, but at the cost of your safety and your ethics or morals, I don't think it's a loss at the end of the day, to be very honest.
Yeah, I think that's really impactful for a lot of people to listen to and keep in mind when they're making their own decisions. And I want to go back to the point that you brought up about the instinctiveness that you've had. It's interesting because with instinct comes this automatic response that you may not even really be thinking about. And I think a lot of times we do set boundaries. So like on the contrary, I think we do set a lot of boundaries that we don't even realize, right? And then we also don't set boundaries where we need to, right? So it's kind of this double-edged sword. But in these instincts, in your reflection and through these conversations that we've been able to have you realized what has gone really well and sort of who has modeled that behavior for you? Has it been your mentors? Like, what are some reasons for why you've had like a positive experience that you were saying you had?
Definitely, I think it's definitely through observing such powerful people. Not powerful, but people who know what they're doing, right? And being in their presence kind of gives you the tools to maybe make boundary settings. So there was an instant where I happened to be in the room when someone was discussing matter of payment with an organizer, and the organizer asked them, how much should we pay you? And their response to that was, how much do you think I deserve to be paid?
Mhm.
Right. And to me, that was like, wow, that's just an amazing way to put it, because you know how much how worthful your art is.
Mhm.
But to place that on the organizers who's inviting you and say, how much do you think I should be? How much do you think I deserve to be paid? Which was a very strong moment for me, where I thought, that's an amazing way how to, be assertive, but not, and draw your boundaries without
Yeah.
being rude about it.
100%. Yeah, and I really like that you said that. And I understand what you mean by powerful people. I know that was like just a moment, like an emotional thing that you said, because we do feel that power to act, right? And I think that's why what you meant by powerful.
Mhm.
And it's very hard to feel that kind of strength, and it's really nice that you had the moment to see that. And I love how you said there's like a nice balance between like putting your boundaries down, but in a way that doesn't come across negative. Because I think a lot of people think that boundary setting has to be like saying no or stopping an opportunity or losing out or like a very negative interaction. But
Mhm.
it could be very positive too, like you said.
Yes.
So I love that. Um, so I'd love for you to talk about how maybe a guru shishya relationship can go both ways, and what that sort of positive versus negative experiences can be there, right, in that mentorship. Because
Mhm.
with mentorship comes a lot of power, and sometimes with that power, people experience control and a need to be respectful in maybe a submissive way. And so we found that a lot of those challenging nuances, even Priya was talking about this, is between gurus and sishyas.
Mhm.
So, positive and negative experiences that you've had related to gurus and sishyas would be wonderful thing to highlight.
Definitely. I think I've had a great opportunity to work with various different teachers throughout my journey. And I mean, as you would know, as NRIs, when we go to India, sometimes we don't have the most pleasant experiences, because sometimes some teachers do see us as a dollar sign. Some teachers see us as, a way to kind of use as an opportunity to come to America.
Mm-hmm.
So the dynamics are so varied for us as artists from another country coming to India with
Mm-hmm.
this thirst to learn. Um, and sometimes we do also come across teachers who kind of shape the career of a student. So they would make artistic decisions for them. They control the opportunities they get.
Mm-hmm.
They control the type of items they would perform. They would control the kind of image they are being branded into. So some people are comfortable with not making any of those decisions and kind of just going along with it. And I think for me, what has been most beautiful is this kind of sharing of art with my gurus, because as any dancer like Janani or Dikshana, you guys would know the content that we deal with in Bharatanatyam is, in Padams and Javalis especially, is very explicit. We talk a lot about sexual encounters, about extramarital affairs, these very sensitive and vulnerable topics. And to be sitting in front of somebody and discussing these and analyzing them and unveiling them and looking at these layers can be, unless there's a lot of trust, I don't think that it would be possible at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I think definitely a guru shishya relationship comes with a lot of trust, with a lot of vulnerability, a lot of mutual respect. So I think definitely, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think in what you were saying, the trust that you're talking about is very much earned, right? And it's something that you have to evolve to, and it's not something that I think should be default. And I just want to add that in here, just say that, because I think what you were saying in terms of you slowly building that respect between student and teacher, allowing the student to also have a say in their journey, and vice versa, is like a shared trust that needs to accumulate over time. So that's amazing. Um, and I definitely want to talk about this perception that you're talking about, like how teachers sometimes control how a student is perceived. And a lot of a student's perception and identity, or any artist's identity, is now on social media. And we're all battling that, of course. And kind of, I want to ask you, what is the privacy and the boundaries that you set between yourself and your rasikas, or the way that you're perceived, and how that perception maybe even linked to your guru as well, and to your community and your co-artists, right? It's a pretty big responsibility to have a social media platform, and that is a big part of what we do in this space. So can you talk a little bit about how social media has affected your identity, some of your decisions and boundaries?
Absolutely. I think social media for me has been both a boon and a bane in many ways. When I was living in Toronto before I moved to India, my only contact to the arts was through the internet. So I learned so much about the arts. I learned so much about various different artists. So I think the inspiration to move to India was definitely through the internet for me, if I were to be very honest. And I think presently now, because I do have a social media account and I am sharing details of my performance career, I definitely pick and choose what I do share on my social media platform. So I don't like to share personal things on my social media. It's definitely a professional account. I think the most personal thing there would probably be my pets, but I think I would like to draw a boundary of what I do share to my audience. So I think definitely that's something. And I would also like to say that I've taken time off social media as well. When things get overwhelming, it wasn't even premeditated. It was kind of just like a moment where I would say, okay, this is getting too much for me. Let me just take a break. And I think this is also very important when you're feeling overwhelmed, or you're feeling like you're at the verge of a burnout, that you just take that time away to be with yourself and, introspect, find yourself again, and come back with more energy.
And do you find that because of social media and how saturated it is, does it affect the way that you create as an artist as well,
Absolutely.
in terms of burnout?
Absolutely. I think the great thing about social media is that we are so connected, but also I think is that we have just so much happening that we lose sight of what it is that we're creating. If we're creating meaningful work, or if we're creating just something because we just want to be seen, or we just want to constantly be on someone's feed, right? So I think for me, definitely creating meaningful content is more important than just creating something every week or every day,
100%. Yes. And I just have one last concluding question for you. I want to quickly go back to when you were talking about how you need to have a very nuanced relationship with your teacher, especially in Bharatanatyam, and especially when you're talking about padams and javalis and the explicit content in that. As a male teacher or a male identifying teacher, or sometimes you have students with different gender identities who are studying under you, and many of them could even be minors, because I'm thinking back to when I was a minor and having to go through some of these things that I haven't even experienced in life, honestly. It can be very difficult to navigate these conversations. So what has been your journey there?
So that's a wonderful question. It's something that I have definitely struggled with, because for me, learning from my teacher, I'm very comfortable to be in this, have conversations with my teacher about this. But when I am supposed to have conversations with my students, say, for example, that student is from America, and they would probably question these padams. They would probably say, how is this even appropriate? Why should I be doing this? Right. So I can't be so explicit in my explanation of these padams to them. I would have to kind of explain it in a way where the content is still there, but they don't feel scandalized by the content. And if you actually think about it, growing up in India and America is very different, because for example, if I was a young child in India, I would be surrounded by this kind of unconsciously. So for example, if you were to go to a temple and see naked sculptures, you wouldn't be, you wouldn't feel uncomfortable with this. So you grow up with this kind of, I wouldn't say you're desensitized to it, but it isn't seen as something that's inappropriate.
Sure.
But in the West, being speaking of being naked is a very private thing that you shouldn't, it's something that it's in your private space.
Sure.
So I think trying to explain these two content like a padam to these two different audiences can be a very sensitive thing. So I would have to choose how to explain it to two different audiences.
Mm-hmm. And where do you see yourself in that journey? Like, do you feel like you have that relationship with your students yet, or are you working on it?
I'm definitely working on it. Okay. Also, as a male, I am a little uncomfortable talking about these things to my female students, right? I don't want them to feel uncomfortable. And I also want them to feel safe. So, I don't want them to say, why is my Anna saying these weird things to me? So yeah. I definitely know I do have a line of what I speak to my students.
Awesome. Thank you. And I really wanted to highlight that because I think it's important that we share where we're also growing. And I really appreciate you being honest about that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think Neha and I will go on to discover Sutikshna's journey coming up here.
Yeah. Thank you for being patient, Sutikshna. We're excited to hear what your journey with boundary setting has been. So what I sort of want to dive into is you have been involved in the art space at a very young age. You come from an artistic family, your mother being a dancer, and you're both a vocalist and a Bharatanatyam dancer. So I sort of want to understand, when did you first understand the need to set boundaries? Was it as a child or as an adult? And in what context? And was the idea of boundary setting something that was instilled in you at a young age, or is that something you sort of have to learn on your own as you went through your artistic journey?
That's an interesting question, because I feel like as I was growing up, boundary setting was more or less done for me by well-meaning others, largely my parents. And my mom also happens to be my guru for Bharatanatyam. And I would say even for music, my guru for music also, when I went at the point that I joined him, treated me with the respect that I would count as a non-negotiable. And so I really didn't have to think about boundary setting for a while. And at points when my boundaries were violated in kind of very impactful and permanent ways, I didn't know what to do. At that point, actually, that's when I was thinking about what Bria said about allyship, and the fact that, and also what Babajin said about confiding in someone else is about as far as it goes when it comes to taking a step towards boundary setting, but to actually take action on it is only happened when I explicitly started talking about it. Honestly, here at CAREspaces, when we started having those conversations, was the first point where I wouldn't even say intention, just this nebulous conversation about it transformed into something a bit more actionable. And that took some activation effort, that took a community of people with similar experiences, that took a community of people with who you knew were there for you. And so to kind of answer your question, it went from not really boundary setting and not even knowing what boundary setting was, to kind of reacting to it perhaps symptomatically, and then going to kind of give back, hopefully, a bit more preemptively.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And, thank you for sort of diving into that for us. It's not really easy to sometimes reflect on your boundary setting journey, especially like when you mentioned you've had experiences that, didn't go so well and your boundaries have been violated. And I think your journey is actually very reflective of most people's journeys, because yeah, we do sort of begin our lives as artists with our parents really setting our boundaries. And then when we start this guru sishya relationship, your guru sort of takes over for you. And it's sort of in your adulthood, you retrospectively look back and go, oh, that a boundary was set then, but it was set for me. So, but no one has taught me to explicitly do this. And now I somehow have to understand how to do it going forward. It can sort of be a very difficult reckoning. And I think what you were saying, Sutichna, really resonates, this idea of reactively setting it rather than proactively. And hopefully conversations like this, and conversations with parents and young parents with kids sort of will spur the conversation of how to proactively boundary set and get us in that mindset very early on. But yeah, something I wanted to dive into a little further with you is that, when you've tried to set boundaries, when was a boundary perhaps not understood in your journey? And to contrast that, when has it worked? When have you successfully communicated this?
Yeah. So I'm thinking of this question in a couple different spheres, as a student and as more recently a teacher. I can't say, perhaps even as an artist, but I'll go with the student first. So as a student, I think there have been times where, like I mentioned earlier, I've been asked to perform for someone who I may not have been comfortable with. That was one of those situations where I tried to avoid it. It didn't really work. And so I had to kind of work around it in my own private way, by saying, sure, I'll do it. Who is the person who is the intermediary? As long as there's an intermediary, that should work. But honestly, most of that conversation was in my head. I didn't really say any of it out loud. Out loud, all I said was okay. And so I guess that brings up another issue of a lot of boundary setting. Like Babajin was saying earlier, you do it instinctively, and sometimes you do it kind of silently in a way that others don't notice, in a way that kind of puts the onus on yourself as opposed to having them change anything about what they're doing. Like I would have felt uncomfortable to say like, hey, the real reason I don't want to do this performance is that this organizer makes me uncomfortable. I think that's something I up till this point have been working on. And maybe after this conversation might change. It might be a catalyst, who knows? But so that's an example of some time when I tried to boundary set by saying things that were kind of indirect, and the other person just it wasn't in their vocabulary, or they didn't kind of understand the underlying message. When it did go well, I think there have been times. So an example I think of is I had a student that I teach message me on social media, and at this point, this was several years ago where I didn't really, again, the word boundary setting or boundaries was not really in my vocabulary, but I did feel uncomfortable with it. And I said, hey, I think thanks for your response, but I think it would be better to keep our conversation to classes. So that's something where if there's a student, if I'm teaching a student, then I'd like there to be a parent involved as well, largely because the students are younger than me and are minors.
No, that's great. I sort of want to process that a little bit and like working backwards. I think this last example you gave sort of touched on the topic of social media that we were, speaking to Babajin about as well, right? This idea of like our personal and professional lives sort of become blurred. And as a teacher, when you're teaching a minor, or when you're teaching anyone, like there is a power dynamic involved as well that's implicit and explicit sometimes. So you're straddling so many different factors when you're struggling to understand, hey, I need to draw this boundary of like communication with a teacher, a student, or a professional can only be done on XYZ platform. I'm not comfortable with something like social media. I'm really happy that, whether it was like explicit or implicit, you were able to set that boundary for yourself and put yourself in a situation where you felt more comfortable. And then sort of like peeling back to your first narrative of a time someone didn't understand your boundaries, you really hit on something very important, right? Like an explicit versus implicit boundary, which you're sort of trying to get to, and maybe beating around the bush and not giving the real reason you're uncomfortable, but giving, some other reason, hoping that it sort of leads that person to understanding. So my follow-up to that, Sudikshna, is that, do you hope to someday be in a place where you can give the explicit boundary and the explicit reason? Is that something that you personally feel is practical? And there is no right or wrong answer. And I totally agree, it might change depending on the situation, but have you reflected on that at any point?
Yeah, so it's interesting. One of the things that Priya was saying earlier about this, the almost sometimes the beauty of relationships between artist and organizer, or guru and sishya, whoever that dynamic may be between, being relational as opposed to transactional. And when it's relational, it's you kind of feel bad to set boundaries. Sometimes you kind of feel bad to be like, oh, I've known you for a while, you can't really pay me too much, and so I'll do it anyway because I've known you, or things, or like I've taught we've known your family for a while, so I won't ask you for payment for when your student or your child. So I think one of the misconceptions that I've held is that being relational is mutually exclusive with setting boundaries, and being transactional is not just boundary setting, but rude. So I think I would like to kind of blur that, or not blur, but I would like to be kind of unanimous with the way I apply boundary setting and the way I define it for myself. So to answer your question in short, yes, I would like to be explicit with it, because I do think that even outside of the arts spheres, within my personal relationships, having boundaries has actually, the times I've tried to set boundaries with a friend, for example, have actually only strengthened the friendship. And that gives me a bit more faith. Of course, a friend is already bought into the relationship and means well for you, which may be different as you go to an organizer or a teacher, or someone who with the power dynamic is a bit different. But yes, I do think at the end of the day, if that person is well-meaning towards you, and trusts you, then they will understand that you are just doing what will make communication better for both of you, and that boundary setting is not in the favor of an individual, but in the favor of a sustenance of the entire community. So yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I actually have one question about this power dynamic that you were talking about. And you were talking about how you're teaching students who are younger than you, but maybe their parents are older than you. So that's a very different type of power dynamic where there's like a shift in power, right? Where no longer you're the teacher that's making all the decisions for the student. Like there's the power of the parent as well. So have you noticed that has been a difficult boundary to set? I'm asking this because I feel like teachers are getting younger and younger, and it's a very hard space to navigate.
That is a very relevant question, and I'm glad you asked it. I have experiences on both sides of the coin. So one side being, as a younger teacher, as a female-based teacher, I have felt, and I don't know how much of this is in my head or actually exists out loud, but I do think that I draw from observations that make me wary. Asking for payment. That's one where I've definitely felt at the asking hand as opposed to the giving hand. That makes it harder to be transactional. Really, at the end of the day, if you look at it black and white, I am giving a service and they are receiving a service, therefore they give a payment for the transaction. But there's so much more to it than that. And a lot of my misconceptions were with or hesitances would be, I'm younger, I shouldn't be asking for money. That's not respectful when the parents of the student I'm teaching are older than me by far. they're going to think I'm, like asking too much. And like we were saying earlier, part of it is also because I identify as female. On So that would be situations where I really, really overthought every single word I put into an email, and felt like I had to justify myself in like 5 different ways to ask for payment. And it took the help of my parents sitting with me and being like, yeah, you can strike out about like 95% of these words, to realize, it's actually that simple. I just need to be straightforward, and that's it. And it was respected, for the most part.
Like I was going to get to this. I think it would be nice to sort of touch upon, like you said, how it's difficult to ask for payment, things like prostration, how it's like awkward to maybe deal with a student who's younger than you, but you're younger than the parent, and the parent is sort of like idolizing you in this like guru worship way. Like sort of, I think those dynamics are very important to explore here.
Thanks. Actually, prostration was the exact thing that I was thinking about, because I've had parents be like, "Oh, do namaskaram to akka." I'm like, "No, no, no! Please don't do namaskaram to akka," because I do feel, it's not just an age thing, and it's not that just because someone is old, like far older than you, I just like fall flat at their feet. I do feel like in a relationship that is two-way, that in a relationship that is, I try to treat as mutual, it skews it far towards, power dynamic, power being put on me, if they do namaskaram to me. And I recognize that it may be part of what's considered traditional. I recognize that it may be, kind of naturally what people do in the mold of a guru sishya relationship. But if that's the case, then I wouldn't call mine a guru sishya relationship. I think I'm far, like, guru is nowhere near a word that would be used for me, and it's not like a modesty thing. It's an empowerment thing, and I want to feel the student to feel, comfortable to share things with me, in an equal relationship. And I do think that respect begets respect.
That's really great. I loved how you phrased that. My one last concluding question for you, is maybe like a little meta in a sort of way, but do you think that in your experience, because you seem to have had a lot of time to reflect on boundary setting and have had a lot of experiences having to do so, whether forced or willingly, we are sometimes put into certain situations, of course. But how do you think about having this conversation with someone who's already bought into this idea of boundary setting? Because obviously everyone here today, we agree that there's an importance to setting boundaries, but in your experience with Deekshana, like how do you handle a conversation when you speak to someone who hasn't bought into this idea at all? Like what are those challenges?
I'm glad that you asked that. I'm all for meta. So I don't feel like I've done this within the arts sphere. I have done it within other spheres, like more personal, but perhaps that is the answer to the question, that, when it comes to speaking to someone who you feel uncertain of how the results of being vulnerable will go, practice it with someone who is a bit more comfortable, who is bought into you. That's how it kind of worked for me at this point, where I have, spoken with peers, spoken with friends, spoken with my parents as well. I honestly think all of those things were mini stepping stones to the way, to my ability to, which I haven't done yet, but, perhaps speaking with someone. I'll revise that. With my guru for music, I do feel like I've been, a bit more, bold to say things like, in this, concert list, I, actually don't feel comfortable with the song, as opposed to just taking whatever suggestions he gives, because I don't want to be disrespectful. Again, he never suggested that I shouldn't have a say back, but that was something that I personally kind of was, felt odd about, voicing, my opinion. And I think that's something I do feel braver now to do, and luckily was respected.
I love that. And I think to wrap up everything you've said, I just want to say that I love that you've reflected so much and that you've had the opportunity to. And I hope it wasn't all after, things have cascaded, because a lot of times I found myself doing that when things have really accumulated, and that's when we really stop and think about some of these things. So for everyone listening, like, I hope you take some time to think about things proactively, and I hope we all move towards that as a community. And I also want to say, like, people will surprise you. Like you said, Sutikshna, I love that you said that, because sometimes you just have to try. And by asking, you don't really lose a lot, because it's the way that you ask, right? Typically, that's usually what sends a disrespect message or a respect message to the other person. So a lot of times just asking, and you'll be surprised that people like your guru or anyone else would be open to the boundaries and your preferences. So I definitely want to say thank you for highlighting all of those things, and all three of you've been so insightful for us in this conversation. So we really, really appreciate it. We hope this is a starting point for many artists to speak to one another, not just artists, but even within your own families. Even like other stakeholders are very important in this space. So making sure that you speak to organizers and people who are hosting you if you're touring, parents, students, everyone is equally important. And that's one of the biggest messages we want to say. Like, this is not all on the artists to do. And that's very important. The onus is not all on artists in this community. So thank you all so much.
So now we'll be starting the second part of our session with our subject matter experts, Dr. Swadna Rajagopalan and Sachin Pense. Jenny and I have a very close relationship with Swadna Aunty, so don't be alarmed if I or her refer to her as Swadna Aunty. It feels a little too formal to, call you Dr. Rajagopalan constantly or Dr. Swadna. But with that being said, we'd love to hear your perspectives.
This is nicer.
That's awesome. Yeah. So with that being said, I'm just going to briefly introduce them. Jenny and I will do that, and then we'll sort of just dive into the next part of our session. So first with Swadna Aunty, Dr. Swadna Rajagopalan is a political scientist by training. She founded Prajna in 2006, a small gender equality nonprofit with a public education mandate. Prajna's awareness work includes training programs and workplace harassment, which is how she met the CAREspaces team. Welcome, Swadna Aunty.
Happy to be here. So proud of all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aunty. And now we have one of our own team members and an amazing peer support specialist and someone who's pursuing his PhD. So a little bit about Sachin. Sachin Pense is a PhD student in human-centered computing at Georgia Tech. He studies how culture and identity influence how we experience and understand our mental health, and subsequently the journeys we take to find care. A significant part of his research is centered around the role of peer support in diverse cultural contexts, including the United States and India. Sachin is also on the executive board of CAREspaces, serving as our co-peer support and education lead. Thank you so much, Sachin. One of the first services that CAREspaces released was the peer support service, so we've really enjoyed working with Sachin and Sutikshna in that way.
Super honored to be here, super honored to be a part.
Another fun tidbit is Swadna Aunty actually provided training, as she sort of alluded to in her bio, to the entire CAREspaces team when we, we're very early on in our journey. So we're very thankful, and we've learned so much. And I don't know if we would be having as nuanced of a conversation as we are today if we didn't have that training from her.
Yes, you would.
We are forever grateful.
I'm happy to be on your journey with you.
Thank you. So we're actually going to start this section kind of candidly, like, since we know both of you, and you've been listening to the journeys of these artists who were speaking before us. And I do want to say their journeys are not representative of everyone in the art space. So keeping that in mind as well. But just quickly, like, what has stood out to you in these artists' perspectives, or anything that you know about the Indian arts? And we can have Swadna Aunty maybe point out a few things.
Yeah, I was struck by the fact that all of them started out by talking about physical safety and respect. You had several talking points in there, but the initial discussion started there and hovered there and stayed there. Although later on they talked about contractual relationships and finances. But as a security studies scholar, that's my primary training, I was very struck by that initial definition of what was the most important boundary to them. And also common, I think, to all of their narratives was the importance of the people around you. Family, but they talked about peer support groups and mentors. And I think it was Babajin's account of hearing someone actually articulate how you set a boundary. And I was thinking how important it is to model the boundaries you want people to set. And in some, I'm old enough to remember that there was a time when there were boundaries. I mean, Indians were not touchy-feely people at all. So if somebody touched you who was not supposed to be touching you, that is almost anybody other than your mother or your spouse, that was already a red flag. But we've lost that, and we haven't actually replaced it with any other of the codes that we used to internalize growing up. You know, don't do this, that's a good sign, that's a bad. You just learn them. I couldn't recall to you, and it wouldn't be relevant exactly how, but you just knew that these were the red flags you had to look out for. And if this happened, you're supposed to be extra careful. But we've lost that. And unless somebody models to you what boundary setting looks like, that you never have a chance. Maybe I'm sort of getting ahead of myself in this response also, but these are the notes I made. So also thinking then about learning from the get-go, then how do you do that and where do you start? And maybe this is something we can come back to. You know, our notions of being a good boy and a good girl, and which goes along with the idea of being an agreeable person. I was going to say, you know, we're always told as Indians, you know, adjust. Adjust is like the favorite Indian word of all time, maybe. You know, adjust to this, adjust to that. But I want to say also, when Sutikshna was talking, what jumped out at me, and this is something you should probably talk about in a different setting as well in CAREspaces. She framed the Guru-Shishya relationship as disempowering by saying, I'm not a guru, I want to empower my students. She was actually implying that there is something deeply disempowering about the traditional Guru-Shishya relationship. And I can think of people who would want to have that conversation in both directions. And I think it would make for a very interesting debate down the line for you. But anyway, those are my notes.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll revisit some of those points as well. But before that, Sachin, if you could talk about, from your perspective, what stood out.
Yep, absolutely. It's very, very similar thoughts to Swarna Auntie. And drawing on some of my background, thinking about what people's journeys are with regards to how they know that they're feeling distressed, knowing that they need care. I think it was really interesting that different people in the panel referred to their experience finding boundaries and figuring out what their boundaries are as journeys. I thought that was really interesting. And I think that it's like, I think it's tough, right? That journey ends up being so fraught and distressing, right? Because it is often reactive, right? And I think Sutikshna said this the best, right? That it's often reactive to different incidents that may have happened. And I think that was in a lot of the stories from the different panelists, I think that was one commonality. But I'm really glad that we're having this conversation, because I think that we're starting to shift from, right, this journey being, okay, where do I feel unsafe and how do I feel unsafe, to a journey of, okay, what do I need to feel, like Swarna Auntie was saying, and like Sutikshna was saying, most empowered, right? Performing at my best and feeling happiest. So I think what stuck out to me most was that sort of movement from like a journey centered around primarily safety to one centered more around both safety and also like, what do I need for my well-being?
That's incredible. Yeah, and I actually want to just take this moment to transition to peer support for a second and then come back to Swarna Auntie's points. And Swarna Auntie, feel free to jump in for the stuff that Sachin will be saying. But I just want to understand how the intervention of peer support comes into this space of empowerment and of the different characteristics of security and safety that we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Sutikshna said it like incredibly, right? When she talked about how like being in a community of people who you know will support you and make you feel safe is like the most conducive environment for like being able to know like what your boundaries are and when they've been violated. So as we've talked about before, right, I think that peer support is something that people have been doing since the dawn of time, right? People who want to support each other, right? People who have similar lived experiences doing that for each other. I think that's been done like for all of human history, right? It's no different than us helping a friend when we find out that they're in trouble in a lot of ways. But I also think that like the framework of peer support, right, came out of like the mental health consumer movement in the 1960s and 70s in the United States. And I think what's interesting about that is that a lot of people who were coming out of the movement had really terrible experiences, right, with psychiatry, with like mental health institutions. And one of the things that happened afterwards is they said, well, if these institutions that are supposedly made to care for us, right, if they aren't working, let's care for each other. And that process of caring for each other, right, and discussing what had happened in these institutions and how they experienced distress helped them to understand, okay, like, here's where my boundaries were violated, right? Here are where things happened that did not feel right and did not feel safe to me. And also spurred on a conversation around like, what's the complement to that, right? Like, what's the alternative to these forms of quote unquote care that would actually make people feel much more safe? I think what's interesting and where that applies here is that I think that peer support is like a really core place for people to come together, right, in a safe space and process together where their boundaries may have been violated, right? And like I mentioned, like propose alternatives in terms of what makes each other feel safe rather than having this like top-down disempowering approach.
I actually wanted to jump in really quickly. That's fantastic. And, you know, I love how you started with this idea of like, we've been doing peer support in some form from the dawn of time. We just didn't have a name for it. But as we're on this like theme of like allyship through peer support, Sadnandi, I wanted to hear your thoughts on it because, you know, CAREspaces has been a safe space to speak about this only for like a year and a half, but you've been doing this for a much longer time, and you've implemented multiple methods to sort of create these safe spaces and help people speak about, you know, allyship and help people speak about how they can set boundaries better. So I would, you know, love for you to dive into that as well a little bit.
I would be a little wary of describing myself as an expert. I think, you know, it's just, I'm older than all of you, so I've been trying to do this longer. I mean, that's the reality, right? Because how do we raise people, humans in this culture? We raise them by teaching them to acquiesce, teaching them to adjust. And so for every one of us, once we cross the terrible twos when we first learn to say no, it's about learning to say yes and wrapping yourself around that. So then to become an adult and to realize that you have a right to say no, you have a right to set boundaries. And it doesn't always have to be, I think somebody said this earlier, it doesn't always have to be a dramatic, negative assertion, right? It can be as simple as, I don't feel like eating this today. But the careful peeling off of your choices, of your everyday choices, and learning that you don't have them, and that it's not okay to assert them, can contribute in time to not knowing how to set any boundaries at all. And I think for all of us, this is hard. Yes, we do talk about boundaries in the context of consent in relationships, in the context of gender-based violence, in the context of what is acceptable and unacceptable office behavior. But if you ask me, when we over the years, as I have had multiple conversations about it, it seems to come down to two things for me. And one is, do we raise people with the confidence to say that what I prefer matters? If I don't think I matter, then why would I even bother to set a boundary? You know, then I'd just roll over and let people walk all over me. If I think I matter, then how is it that I learn to say no? Where does it begin? When somebody has a cute child and you reach out and you tap its cheek, and the child doesn't like it. But then what do we say? Come on, be a good girl, let auntie give you a kiss. Why? Why should auntie be in your face at all? But we don't do that. So the longer I do this work, I know you're talking about a very grown-up external public context, but I think I'm beginning to think this is where it starts. And so more and more in terms of modeling, when we do workshops, we actually have little script lines where we make students repeat no, we make them repeat, how would you ask this question at a workshop? How would you ask this question at a job interview? Do you have a sexual harassment policy? How do you say these things? Because we don't have the words, we don't have the confidence, and we don't have the role models. And I see the time prompt, so I'll politely stop here and
No, that's just sort of guiding for us. I think our first section was a little bit more structured in timing because we had so many different voices to balance, and we wanted to make sure everyone really got the time to sort of reflect their journey. But this is more about us bouncing ideas off of each other. We don't really see it as like, this you must answer, this Sachin must answer, because I think both of you sort of combined have the right reflection for this.
I actually have one thing I want to say here and actually ask Sachin this question. So one of the reasons we did this panel discussion was, Swarnanti touched on like the ability to say no and where that confidence comes from, or the lack of, right? But for Sachin, when we've done this this peer support program through CAREspaces, we've been thinking about like how do we help people who are not in that position now that they've been brought up in this certain way, or that they've practiced this art form or in this space, right? That's where we are now. And of course, like, I think I love the conversations about modeling things for the future generations, but for existing generations and, the people that we're hearing about right now, they're in this position where they can't say no because it's costing them too much, or that they're not in a privileged space to say no necessarily, or that they don't have the confidence to, for whatever reason. So how can, a lot of tough decisions, and those decisions can really weigh down on people in terms of mental health. So how would you say that, either our work through CAREspaces or like any of the work that you've done could kind of help alleviate some of that stress and that burden that they're holding?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that as we talked about in the last panel, right, asserting your boundaries, especially given the kinds of power relationships that exist in this space and like a lot of spaces, if not all spaces, right, that's a really, really distressing thing, right, especially when it's centered around safety, around you being able to practice your art well. So one of the concepts that I've definitely heard a lot about that I think is really important here is the concept of the access need, coming from Mia Mingus and their disability justice work done from like Sins Invalid, which is this collective, a disability justice collective in the Bay Area, right? So the idea of an access need is something that a person needs to be able to communicate, learn, or take part in an activity. And I think what's important about this is that it's not necessarily reactive, right? I think that safety is a part of it, right? In terms of what people, right, need to be able to, again, be able to learn, perform well. But I think what's important to note about this framework of thinking about access is that everyone has these needs, right? Whether it is, I need to step away every couple of hours to be able to use the bathroom, or I need very clear instructions on like financial compensation, right? Or I need clear boundaries between like what our student-teacher relationship is, right? I think that all people, and the like part of this framework is that all people have those boundaries, and it's also the job of everyone to be able to make sure that these boundaries are being enforced and that we're making our spaces as accessible as we can for everyone involved. So I think one part of it is also shifting the way that we think about boundaries. I think that safety is always a huge part of it, right? But also thinking about it in terms of like, what can we do to make these spaces safe enough and accessible enough such that everyone is performing at like their best capability and in a way that makes them feel happy. And then also thinking about it, like I mentioned, in terms of it being everyone's responsibility, given that everyone has these needs to make sure that a space is accessible.
I love that you said that. It's like when we think of boundaries, I always think of like drawing a line or no or a wall almost, but you're explaining how we can turn that into a door, right? And it's like, here, I'm actually letting you enter the space in a better way, and I'm letting myself enter your space in a better way, and let's discuss that. And I think when we talk about access needs, it allows both parties, because I think it's very important that both parties in a relationship have the ability to discuss what works for each of them, right? Because we don't want the contract to sway one way or the other, or a negotiation, or relationship to be one way or the other. That is not healthy at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that you said access need is like a new way that we can approach this conversation. I do want to go back to Swarna Aunty for just one more moment and ask about, you were talking about upbringing, and I think many people are worried that adjusting and the way that you present yourself really reflects not on themselves, but on the people they're indebted to, like their parents and their teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where the pressure becomes so much more. Like, I don't even think they would mind coming across differently if it was just to reflect on them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the pressure is a lot more because it reflects on the people that are guiding them, like their parents and their teachers. And we're taught with that mindset from the beginning, that you're representing something bigger or something that's more powerful than you. So do you have any words to help people navigate that?
Actually, I learned about access need, this idea from Sachin today, and I love it. I'm going to use it probably inappropriately a lot. But I think that when you are talking about, when you talk about access needs, the only way you can meet them is if the entire community meets them. So moving away from thinking about whether something reflects well on parents or teachers or aunties or guides, it actually becomes incumbent upon those people to teach you to do this, So in a situation where all of us are talking, it becomes my job to tell you, as the oldest person in the group, that no, it's okay to set this boundary. You should look out for yourself. I think that it's not about whether the young artist or the young professional or the young performer is right or wrong to set boundaries. It's about everybody saying, you should do it and we will back you up. And I think this is why you've begun your work with peer support and with these sessions, but your work will only really take root when you work with the community itself. So that this is also the kind of work that we do at Pratnya. We have the conversations about the conversations, essentially, because otherwise everything else is in a vacuum. The 5 people who attend our webinar will get the message, but chances are they already knew the message. How is it that we go beyond that and create the enabling environment that allows all of us to see that these access needs are met? Am I using that correctly in a sentence, Sachin?
Yes, I absolutely think so. And I think that's really, really interesting commentary, right, on what it takes to be able to have this framework in this environment.
I actually think this is a really great segue to a follow-up I had, because, Swarna Aunty, you're talking about, okay, like it's one step that we all agree, us on this webinar, right, that access needs need to be met, or boundaries in general. But how do you provide the tools, which you've sort of explained you've done in the past, to get people to have these conversations? So to both of you, I want to sort of ask, like, how can we start these conversations? What are some key pointers? Like something like, hey, you can say X, Y, and Z to get the ball rolling, especially with something like access needs, which is new to a lot of people, this idea and framing boundaries in this way, because we often think of it very rigidly as a protected class, right? When we think about the law, but an access needs sort of, it encompasses everything, including that and everything in between that's not explicitly stated as a boundary or a need that needs to be met. So can you give us some conversation starters, perhaps? Sachin, I don't know if you want to start.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that one way of framing it that I've thought about, so I have a couple of different thoughts, right? I think that one of the things that is definitely very necessary are these kinds of conversations around, like you mentioned, like the meta conversation of like, what kinds of things do we need to be talking about in our community for people to be more aware about boundaries? And I think one part of that is thinking more about like who's empowered and who isn't. So like one of the things that I remember us discussing is, right, like I think that it's totally fair for teachers, gurus to be supportive of their students having private WhatsApp groups or private chat groups to like debrief and talk about things that are happening in that space, right? Because I think that it's through those kinds of conversations that people come to understand, okay, this is what I need to make me feel safer, to make me perform better, right? Or to make me just feel happier like in the space. So I think that's an important part of it, right? Making space for students to have those conversations, even separate of their guru or their teacher, but even with that guru or teacher's support. And I think the other part of it that's also really important is, again, like I said, the peer support part of it, right? So having people even who are outside of the space to talk to be able to debrief about where like certain norms, right, may be disempowering, right, and where alternatives might be able to exist.
100%. And I think we think that the space is too nuanced to explain it to someone else, but that's what we've been trying to do with peer support, is that we're trying to explain it to people who we consider outsiders, because we can actually be pretty empathetic in the way that we interact with one another, and empathy is a huge part of peer support, from what I've heard from you. So understanding what the other person's saying, and part of that empathy is also when someone is approaching you with an access need or a boundary, they're not confronting, and they're not trying to disagree. Like, we're not trying to start an argument here, right? It's almost like we always assume that's what it is, or they're just upset and they're saying something. It could just mean that they want to be more comfortable, and that's really it.
And I think one additional part and one comment I want to make is that, right, I think Swarna Aunty said it best about how this is a dialogue, right? So I think that one important part of it is like teachers, people in power, not taking it personally when someone says, hey, XYZ situation makes me feel unsafe, right? Or XYZ dynamic makes me feel very unsafe. And this is what I need to be able to, again, perform better, like feel happier, feel more welcome in this space. And I think like that kind of framing is one, maybe like an easier way to approach it for people, that like, hey, this makes me feel unsafe, and here's what I need to be able to like feel safer, perform better.
And on the note of these conversation starters, Swarna, did you have anything else to add? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no. I was just thinking, I've actually been going back to the Guru Shishya's disempowering thing. That's going to be my second thing to think about after this conversation. I think, because I think of teaching as an empowering profession. I think teachers are supposed to do, in my school a long time ago, we had these aims and objectives at the front of our yearbook, and one of them was to form and to inform, and we used to have to write essays on these things. And I've carried that with me, and I think that whatever it is that you are teaching, whether it's music or political science or quadratic equations or technology, I think you are not simply delivering a certain body of content. You're also then joining the student for a few months or a few years on their journey in which they learn about life. And to learn about life, you need to learn about these things. So if a student came up to me, I hope, maybe I don't do this, who knows? If a student came up to me and said, I'm uncomfortable with this, or this is happening, I would actually try my best to step back, let them say what they could, and try to help them find a solution for themselves, or at least validate their experience, because it's real to them. And I think these are also human things. It's not necessarily that you have to have training to do this. This is how human beings, and this is Sachin's earlier point, this is how we are. This is who we are. So I think that the conversation starter can be anything. The conversation starter is an everyday thing. It can also be your own experience, of feeling like, oh, I should have said this, but I didn't. I should learn to say no. I should learn to ask. Or sometimes, look, I never learned how to ask for money, but I think you should learn. When people come to do interviews with us at Prajna, sometimes we wait. Mostly women apply, and young women. They talk about everything, but most of them hesitate to ask about salaries. Now, it's not like we have a lot of money to give people, and usually the answer to the question is bad news. Nevertheless, it's important to prompt them. I ask, I said, don't you want to ask me about money? So then they find the words and they ask the question. And the only thing they take away from the interview is the ability to ask that question. That's still a positive. So there are 100 moments at which you can intervene to share survival skills that, quite frankly, you may not have mastered yourself. You fake it in front of your student, you fake it in front of your child, and along the way you figure it out as well.
I love that you said that, and I think one of the earlier points that were made also comes to this, that the onus is really not on only one person. It's not on the person receiving. It's on the person giving, on the organizer, in the artist organizer situation, on the teacher. Like, everyone has to share this responsibility. So I love that. Neha, do you want to start by kind of going through some of the dialogues that we've gotten a lot of questions on how to respond? And I just want to caveat this by saying that this is not advice. This is not mental health advice. We're not telling you how to act. These are just simply model situations that we've heard too often. And we want to make sure that people just understand what the premise of response would look like around it.
So we've sort of sourced a lot of these statements from previous interactions we've had with people, some questions that were sent in during this session and our RSVPs. As you know, I'm a professional too, has been a 5-part campaign. So the culmination of all of these topics we've spoken about really ends or starts, depending on how you want to think about it, with boundary setting. So that's sort of the inspiration and the source of a lot of these statements. So I'm just going to read them out, and Sachin or Swarnanti, whoever wants to jump in first, if you can just sort of give your opinion and reaction to it, that would be great. And like Jenny said, just to reiterate, it is purely their opinion and reaction. There is no one way or right way to do this, because everyone is different and in a different environment under different circumstances. So the first one being, now that I'm an adult, I can set boundaries better. What are some thoughts that flow into your head when people say that?
I'm not sure that's true. I think you have to practice a lot. You may recognize the need to set the boundary more, but the confidence about having the ability, I'm not so sure of.
To add on to that, I think that the underlying kind of principle right behind that quote is that the person who's saying it, right, and it's something that we've heard a lot, right, understands that they have to be a different person, right, to be able to express that boundaries, whether it be an adult, right, or be bigger in the community. And I think that's an important thing to think about, going back to thinking about power, right, how someone might be disempowered from being able to actually speak about their boundaries.
And this sort of relates to what we heard some of the artists saying, that boundaries, I think Sudikshna was speaking about this specifically, boundaries have been set for you as a child. So it's when you get into adulthood, you either realize you have to do it for yourself, or through an actualized power dynamic related to age or whatever it might be, you're like, oh, I can do this now, quote unquote, I'm allowed to, or have the space to do so. So our next sort of reflection point is this idea that my colleagues trust this artist, therefore I can let my guard down. I don't need to explicitly set boundaries.
I think the boundaries in your head matter here. You should have boundaries vis-a-vis the whole world. Or maybe I'm just being overcautious. I wouldn't advise anybody to walk around the world with no boundaries in their head. But to also, we each make this choice to trust or not to trust, to decide that we can be comfortable in a space. And it's context dependent, isn't it? But if this were a person in my universe and they said this to me, half in the hope of advice or my opinion, I would say, never completely let your guard down.
Yeah, and Sachin.
Yep, absolutely. And I think what also sticks out to me about the statement is, I think, something that Sudikshna brought up, right, with the relationality, right, of how some boundaries get trespassed, right? That, okay, well, if I know this person super well, yeah, I guess I can perform for them for free, right? Or like some of those comments, right? I think that this comes back to the need, right, in community to set like boundary setting and have that be the norm, right? Even around people that we may know really well, or people that we've heard great things about, right? Like I said, I think that reorienting it towards boundary setting being a thing that makes everyone's art better, kind of helps with that.
Yeah, and I think some of the underlying currents here are because in all of these art spaces, be it the Carnatic music space, Hindustani music space, or Bharatanatyam space, the spaces that we've heard about today, and there are many more, it's so close knit. And you usually know someone who knows that person at the very least. So that's why you sort of use your network to build this trust. But I completely agree that just because somebody else has a relationship with someone and they have that trust and boundary doesn't mean it's implicit that you should accept that boundary as your own. And as artists, unfortunately, we are sometimes forced to do so because it gets back to this idea of, are you being difficult? Are you being a team player? Like, why can't, if everyone in your circle can accept this one situation, why can you not accept it, right? Janani, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, and I kind of want to get back to the name of our series here. I'm a professional too. When we say that, we always think of like being the most, like Neha said, a team player. And we think we like misconstrued, being professional as easy to work with, or like as trying to fit in easier or be less difficult, right? In any context. And it almost makes it harder if you know someone through someone else, because you owe it to two people now, not just one. And it's almost like we transfer this trust. And even Babajin was talking about like it has to be earned, very much so. So like to encourage people to like earn trust and also make sure that when they're giving trust that it is earned, and having that little check in your head.
I think
we do want to.
yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I think I was going to go to the next one, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was actually just going to say, I think we sort of covered this next one, but I think it's important to read it out in case either of you have a separate reflection or anything to add to what we've said. So go ahead, Janani.
Yeah, so I was going to read that, Sachin was talking about WhatsApp groups for students. So in the perspective of a student, they say, I want to set a boundary, but I'm concerned that my needs might make class difficult for other students. So not even that you're making class difficult for the teacher who is in the power dynamic, but making class difficult for the people who are kind of in the same power dynamic as you, right? So do you guys have anything to add to that?
I think it would be lovely to think of the teacher as being a person who makes it possible for the student to say this in front of the other students. So there is an open conversation, an ability to dialogue, and for this student to explain what that need is and where it comes from, and have the other students take that on board and then express where they come from on it. I think I understand if class is 1 hour and 45 minutes goes in this negotiation, someone is going to complain. But having said that, because as we've said, teaching is about so much more than just the delivery of content. I think that would be a very good lesson for all of them to take away, to have a classroom that allows that.
Mm-hmm. And I also think that's a great point. And I also think in the disability justice community and within thinking about this framework of access needs, there's a lot of discussion around conflicting access needs, right? So what happens when someone has an access need that actually conflicts with someone else's access need, right? And it sounds like it sounds a little strange maybe, but it does happen like quite a bit, right? Given the different things that we might need to feel safe. And I think what needs to happen in situations like that, and what needs to happen at a community level is, I think Swarna Auntie said it best, right? Like thinking of your guru or your teacher as someone who, right, makes the space feel comfortable for you, but also someone who teaches you this art, right? And I think one alternative to the way that the system is set up now, and something that I know that we talk about in CAREspaces, is having many different teachers with different, like, who cater to different kinds of students with different access needs, right? Or different kinds of accessibility, right? If there are conflicting access needs, I don't think that there should be any stigma against, right, like changing your guru or changing your teacher to be in an environment that makes you feel, like I said, better at performing your art and happier.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
And it's not something we hear often, that you can actually change your teacher because you feel like you're almost stuck with this person for your entire tenure. And it's not always negative, but yes, you're very much connected to that person. And when you go to another teacher, there's this like mindset, oh, what happened there? And everyone wants to know what happened there. But it could even be just as simple as, hey, I think I learned with a better learning style elsewhere, or I have a better learning environment elsewhere. That's a great
Absolutely.
point.
I think we can, so we have one more statement that we'd love both of you to reflect on. And then we also have a couple audience questions that we'll move on to, before wrapping up the session. But so the last statement is, it sort of, I think, brings our entire conversation full circle, because this is a question we started off with in terms of the reflection statements. But I want to set boundaries, but I haven't really talked about this during my tenure for many decades. How do I start? And really quickly, I think this is important because we spoke about how we have these long-standing relationships already. So how do we start setting those boundaries without breaking the bonds?
I think, because this could describe somebody like me quite easily, I would actually start by being very honest and just saying this. I have now been thinking about this. I've been interacting with CareSpaces. They had me come to this webinar where I faked expertise in this area. But I want to tell you very honestly that there are many times when I struggle with this. And I think the thing about doing it at the end of many decades is that you have the confidence and the security, I hope, as a person, to stand up there and say, I have no idea. I think this may be how I get it done. I can't go back and fix what I've done in the past, but these may be the words I use now. To be open to learning is to be able to teach, I think. So I would just start in that situation, which could be quite realistic for me. I would just start by saying, I don't really know how to do this. And I know in the past where I would have shut up and taken being sidelined or dismissed by virtue of my gender or things that I studied, I have, because there have been younger people in the room, I have been able to assert myself. I've been able to overcome that hesitation to be assertive, to push back. Because I think if I don't do it with all my gray hair, then who is going to do it? Who is going to model this moment for them? You know? So this is why it's so important to be in learning mode all along, I think.
Yeah, Sachin, if you want to quickly reflect, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, I think that is a fantastic point. And I think especially the idea that, right, like even as a teacher, right, the core part of being a teacher is continually learning, right, from the people around you. But I think another really important part of it that Swarna Auntie touched on is, right, and I think Janani did as well, right, the strength of the relationship that you have built with the people in your community, right, or with your teacher or with your students over those decades, right? So being really vulnerable and saying, hey, this is something that I feel like I need to start doing because I want to, again, like make my art better, feel happier, or even just need to feel safer, and hoping that the people around you, right, in terms of community norms, don't take that personally, right?
Yeah, and if I may come in, I just want to say that creating that safe space is a two-way street. And I know a lot of older people sometimes hesitate to embark on these newer journeys because they are afraid of being cancelled inadvertently, that they will want to say something to you, it will come out different. And I'm putting that out there because I think that that's a very real fear for many. What if I ask you this question? I actually want to know the answer, but you mistake this for a judgment that I'm not making. I just don't have the vocabulary that you have on a whole host of issues. So I think that both sides need to be open to assuming the best about their interlocutor. You know, otherwise you can't move from point one to point anything.
That's so important. And actually, interestingly, we got a question related to that generation gap, and you answered it from your perspective, and I think that's so effective, because if everyone, regardless of age or which generation they're part of, would just have a learning hat on, we would be in a much more friendly space, and nothing would seem as confrontational. It'll seem more like we're just learning. So it's wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we should take a couple of audience questions. So I'll just cover the first one here, and then I think Neha can take the others. So the first one here is that, what is the difference between a whisper network and peer support, and what are the pros and cons of each?
Yeah, so I can start out with that question, right? So I think that they are complementary resources, right? So a whisper network, and of course, I'm definitely not an expert on this, right, is a network used to alert people, right, or let people know about people who might be unsafe within a community, within a group of people, right? I think that a difference between that and peer support is that one of those is done, right, with people writing down names, but also people like supporting each other, right? I think that a core part of peer support is doing some of that debriefing, right, as much more of a dialogue, often with just one other person or with many other people, right? So rather than it being just a general awareness, I think that peer support ends up being, right, like a safer space, or maybe not necessarily a safer space, but a safe space, one of many safe spaces for people to be able to debrief what they've gone through. Like I said, I don't think these two things are very different from each other, right? I think in a lot of ways they can be overlapping and complementary, but I think those are some of the differences.
Swarnanti, I know you've talked a lot about whisper networks. Do you have anything to add?
Well, in the absence of a peer support network, all you have is a whisper network. So, it tells you where the landmines are, but it doesn't tell you how to avoid them.
I love that you said that. Yeah. And often we think it all falls under this larger umbrella of gossiping, but I would really encourage our audience members to think of it differently, right? We are truly trying to protect one another and keep an eye out for each other. That's, I think, what both the services have in common. So is that empathy factor, and we're not trying to blacklist or hurt anyone in the process. Neha, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think this is great. And it's so important, especially in the Indian performing arts space, because we have never had like specific peer support, right? This is the first time through CAREspaces and our service. So all we've really had to rely on is whisper networks. And I think it's sort of this taboo topic because people think of it as this blacklist, and they think of it as a negative space instead of a positive space. But we really all need to like educate ourselves and understand how whisper networks can be very effective in other spaces as well, sort of learn and draw from that.
So you wouldn't have whisper networks, Neha, if we didn't have so much silence and stigma around what is actually happening. If we could just come right out and say, X harassed me, this happened to me. And if we could talk about it openly and freely, there would be no need for a whisper network. Because the whisper network only happens because we try to pretend that nothing is wrong.
Yeah, I think it's such an important part of validating an experience, because if you're not able to, wherever it is, perhaps to another peer or formally to an ICC or whatever it might be, your experience won't be accepted and validated. That's why you must rely on your whisper network, right? We have another really great question actually that I would love to dive into. So it sort of forms around this idea of how, boundaries can be set to hurt people, especially when they're misused and exploiting your power within the power dynamic. So have you ever seen that be the case, and how would you respond, or what is your advice to a person who has been on the negative receiving end of a boundary, where they've sort of felt like the boundary has been perverted to become something where it is no longer creating a conducive relationship or a safe space?
I'd say that our culture is full of boundaries, right? Who gets to be part of which cultural system? Who is more acceptable, particularly in the classical arts? Which arts are considered classical? I mean, we're a very hierarchical society, and we are extremely proficient at creating boundaries between ourselves. So I think that those are the boundaries I would think of as hurting and harming people. But we also observe no boundaries with each other. in our interactions, because we are the first to inform people that they put on weight, lost weight, gained hair, lost hair, become dark, become fair, whatever it is. We have absolutely no restraint. And I think that's ironic, because one of the our arts are supposed to be spiritual, and one of the most important spiritual exercises or spiritual goals that you're supposed to attain is restraint, control over your senses, control over what you see, what you hear, what you open your mouth and say, control over your impulses, your urges. And we actually have very little of that. So there's a weird way in which we have a society that's crisscrossed with boundaries and constraints, but we have absolutely no interpersonal restraint. And I think that this moment that we're in is about transforming both of those. It's creating access, creating opportunity, while also learning to shut up, keep our impulses to ourselves, keep our hands to ourselves a lot more. So, I think that we shouldn't worry about what is appropriate and determine what is right and do it.
Yeah, and Sachin would love to hear your thoughts as well on this.
It's
a sort of loaded question.
Yeah, in fact, I think one thing that Swarna Auntie said that I think is very important is, right, there's boundaries, right? There are constraints, right? And there are places where we exercise restraint. And I think it's important to think about those three things. I also think that one additional thing I hear from this question is that I don't know, like, I think that the person who may have asked this, right? I think that there is an underlying idea that boundaries are meant to be restrictive, right? Like we talked about, rather than things that, like I said, help you implement your arts better, right? And I think that one way to shift from that way of thinking is, I think, thinking about it as a dialogue rather than, right, a restraint, right? I think that's an important paradigm shift that has to happen.
It's important that we change the language from a boundaries being imposed. It's not like we don't want boundaries to be imposed. We want it to be a dialogue, like you said, and we want it to be a negotiation, hopefully, and a healthy negotiation. I think it's really important what Swarnanti said, that we also think about what, before we request a certain boundary or an access need, like what does that mean for ourselves and why are we asking that? It's like a very important reflection, because it'll also help us negotiate, but it also helps us make sure our intentions are not to restrict someone else to access a space necessarily. Not that you always have to consider someone else, but it's very important, like what Swarnanti said, that some of these boundaries we have in society have really restricted access for people from different socioeconomic status and caste and class and many of those things. So thank you so much.
I think one important part of that is, right, destigmatizing moving spaces, right, and changing spaces.
Yes.
And being able to move from like a space that may not fit your needs, right? There may be parts of that space that make you feel uncomfortable, right? To a place where your access needs are met.
No, I really loved how you sort of like reframe the question, because it is very important. Like you said, and Jenny also said, like a boundary is a negotiation, right? You never take it for what it is. So if you feel that by someone else setting a boundary, you feel disadvantaged, you are allowed to push back on that until you find that happy medium where both of you can exist in the same space. And unfortunately, or fortunately, sometimes the solution is perhaps you can't. And you need to move spaces. And getting back to what Sachin said, it's okay to have this fluidity of the spaces you interact with. And sometimes you need to create new spaces for yourself as well.
And I think I want to add one more thing here, is that I think our community is very reactionary. We're like very ready to like look at someone else's decision and imply whatever we want from it, even though it's really none of our business, right? And I think we really need to move away from that culture where if someone decides to change spaces or move from one teacher to another, it's up to them, and we need to let them exist, right? Without adding more stress to that already very heavy decision that they probably took. And I think that's part of empathy that I think our community needs a lot more of. So I definitely just want to say that. Sorry. Go ahead, Neha. Next question.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually our final question, we sort of covered a little bit going through all of this. So, I think we can sort of just maybe give a wrap up of this entire thing. Jenny, if you want to do that, and I'll go ahead and conclude by, giving the thank yous. And if everyone wants to come on screen for this, I think that would be really great.
So thank you so much for all these wonderful answers. And if everyone else feels comfortable turning on your video, please feel free to do so. If not, please feel free to just listen in. But I just want to say that even in the second part of this conversation, we did call you both here as like subject matter experts, but you were very honest about your own experiences and answering as yourselves. And I think that means a lot to everyone listening. And I think it just promotes this concept of sharing our own journeys with one another. It can be so fruitful for us to learn from. And one of the biggest things that I take away from this is that even Neha and I learned a lot, and I hope everyone has that learning hat on when they're listening, and has the empathy hat on when they're listening. And that's how we hope to move forward as a community. So thank you all so much for your time. I know it's such a busy time of year, and we really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, and one final thank you to all of you. Go ahead, Scott 90.
No, I just want to say thank you for inviting me.
Yep, absolutely. It's our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you to all of our panelists, actually. So I'm just going to quickly give, sort of our formal thank you, because as we know, it takes a village for these events to happen, even when they are virtual. So, first and foremost, obviously, thanks to all of the panelists for being here today. You're all very, very busy people. But Babajin, was barely back to North America, to Canada, when we had our dry run for this session. He was so jet lagged, and we're all in multiple different time zones. Swadnanti and Priya have been so kind to sort of adjust to us being in the US and having this in the morning while it's very late at night for them. So thank you all so much for taking the time and really having this important conversation with our community. We'd also like to thank our co-collaborator, Shreya, from Shreya Nagarajan Singh Arts Development Consultancy. We have worked on this entire series. I'm a professional too with her and her team, and they've been great. And we honestly couldn't have done it without her. And what I couldn't think of a better way to engage, the India audience and the North America audience and bring us together as one fluid community, because that's truly what we are. And that's what this collaboration has really meant for us. And then a special shout out to Jati Priya from the CAREspaces team, and also Sneha from the SNS team. Both of them have been helping with tech and backend. And we really appreciate that, because of course, with virtual events, that is key to the success of everything happening. And then, finally, just once again, thanks to the entire CareSpaces and SNS teams. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks for our audience for their support. We're so excited to, have these 5 beautiful sessions to share with everyone. And, we can't wait to hear your feedback. Thank you.
Yes, and also one last credit to Aishwarya Chandrasekhar, who is on our team, who was the designer for all of the wonderful illustrations that you saw in the campaign. She put a lot of thought into that, and I want to say that she's tried her best to incorporate the meaning of the session into a symbol that represents our community. So thank you so much for unifying our entire community with those wonderful illustrations. And again, thank you all so much for being here.